the idea, the importance of relationship-based and therapeutic social work. Now, I think the climate 10 years ago felt more difficult for this kind of approach to social work, perhaps than it does today. I think there have been some encouraging developments. Ivy Munro's reports are one of them, which Julian Rouche will be speaking about, I think, more after the break. But also just a change of climate in my experience, where there is more openness, more enthusiasm, more hunger for this kind of approach, or re-establishing this kind of approach. Because when I first went to the Tavistock Centre 16 years ago, it felt a bit to me as though it was the kind of last bastion, the kind of last fortress defending this approach to social work, which I thought had been under some assault really for a very long period of time. When I first entered social work, which is in the cliche longer ago than I want to remember, but in the kind of late 70s, it was really quite an alive and vigorous dimension of social work in this country. But it did go into decline, I think. And so the centre was really set up as a network, a national network, to promote and develop thinking of this kind, and practice of this kind. And one of the main things I say about the Centre for Social Work Practice is that it's an organisation that survived for 10 years with absolutely no money at all. And that continues to be more or less the case. We really depend upon, largely speaking, the resources of people and relationships between people. But we do have a number of regional groups, and the Essex group is one of them, coordinated by Jane Hurd, who many of you will know and who will be speaking later, but we have others in London, also in Southampton, sort of south-central England, and in Kent, and in the East Midlands, Central Lamb, Nottingham and Derby. You can join the Centre for Social Work Practice, and we will have a membership stall at lunchtime, which will be run by Jenny Connell near the bookstall. But you can also just kind of sign up to the email list and get information. And there is a website, and the website address is about to appear. There it is. Again, it's not a very well-developed website, but there are some very good resources on there, and we're developing the resources page all the time. And also you get news about local events and other information. So it's very encouraging for us, as Jane has already said, Janet has already said, to be working in partnership with Essex University and Centre for Professional Development Studies. This is a bit of a first for us as well. So I'm going to move into the sort of main body of my talk, which in the first part of it is really just kind of continuous with what I've said, really. The Centre for Social Work Practice was established to give relationship-based and therapeutic social work a much-needed, I think, stronger voice in Britain. But you can't have a voice without having a language. And I think that along with our voice, I think our language had fallen into disuse and sort of relative obscurity in the decades since about 1980 in Britain. That's a whole history that I'm not going to go into. But arguably, you can't really develop either a voice or a language without a community. And the further aim of CSWP, as I've said, really was to build a community for those who want to extend and deepen their practice in this way. Now, these thoughts echo at a different level from the one I'm going to mainly speak about, the main themes of my talk today. To talk about the use of self in social work is to engage with questions about how we experience ourselves in the work we do with other people. And I think particularly how the most disturbing and complex of our experiences can be named by us and symbolised, and how they can then be spoken about and put to use in the context of the relationships that really are at the heart of practice. So my way of summarising this is that really trying to think about the unthinkable and speak about the unspeakable is kind of going to be central to what I want to think and speak about. And I will be illustrating those thoughts in more depth. I think that the ability to do these things is what makes a real difference between human and professional development, or, you know, stasis, stuckness in our development. Well, this idea of the use of self is central to what we variously term relationship-based social work, therapeutic social work, clinical social work, case work, and also to what are now the almost forgotten traditions in this country of psychiatric social work, psychoanalytic case work, and psychosocial therapy. I think that a social worker who identifies with any of these perspectives that I've just mentioned might say that, well, any kind of social work practice must have the use of self at its core. How could it not, they might say. But actually not everyone thinks like that. About 10 years ago, I led a workshop at an Association of Directors of Social Services, as they were then called, conference. And I proposed as a part of this workshop a general definition of social work that went something like this. I can't recall it exactly, but it was something like the provision of a relationship to facilitate service users in the handling or negotiation of personal, family, or community conflicts, transitions, and tensions. Now, it's not a complete, or adequate definition, but it's roughly that I proposed. But one of these directors sort of shot back at me immediately and said, I don't think that people in my area want a relationship. They just want a service. And I thought that perhaps she misunderstood what I meant by relationship. I really meant relationship in a professional context. But I don't think so. I think she carried a sort of split in her thinking between the idea of a service and any concept of its provision through the medium of relationship, and certainly any idea of relationship as a form of service. Well, it's quite easy to be critical or mocking of her reaction, but perhaps this kind of splitting is something which we're all a bit vulnerable to at times. How many of us have bemoaned the way our managers or supervisors don't support the value of the relational aspects of our practice? Or how often do we lament the loss of our capacity to do relationship-based work in hard-end statutory settings, and then sort of denigrate our colleagues in specialist settings like CAMS for their supposedly comfortable, out-of-touch lives doing their therapeutic work? Or how often have we, any of us, protested that if only resources were more plentiful and caseloads more contained, then we would certainly find the space to do more therapeutically sensitive work? And certainly, coming as I do from Tavistock, I'm very well aware of the sort of idealised view that many people sustain, despite any evidence to the contrary, of the kinds of things that happens in that sort of mysterious institution. Now, there may be elements of truth or reality in these complaints or constructions at times, but I suggest they may also disguise a sort of deeper and more uncomfortable split in ourselves. I think we seem to both desire and value this thing we call relationship-based or clinical social work, and yet our apparent hostility sometimes towards those who allegedly might have the time and space to undertake it, or those who we allege have sort of cynically abandoned it, I think this hints at a more sort of fundamental ambivalence about it in most of us. It sort of seems to be always someone or something else that is preventing us from fulfilling our ambition to be more relationship-based. And this is a kind of stance that makes me suspicious. And in a way, a lot of what I want to say today is directed to sort of trying to illuminate and make sense of this ambivalence. Well, the conference is titled, How to Do Relationship-Based Practice. So am I going to tell you about how to do it? Well, not exactly. Rather, I'm going to be speaking about questions that, in my view, precede the possibility of doing it, relate to the kinds of emotional and mental capacities we've got to have available to us if we are to have any chance of actually doing it well. The importance of relationship-based practice is very much back on the agenda following Eileen Munro's review of the child protection system. And one central theme of her reports has been the tendency of the whole childcare and child protection system to become too caught up in acting or doing on the basis of essentially formless compliance with procedures, protocols, timescales, performance management systems, and so on. However, as I think a lot of people have noted, stripping away some of these kind of, I think often falsely reassuring external structures and systems may carry the risk of exposing practitioners in all sorts of ways. Not least, I think, exposing them to the emotional and relational complexity of the work. And beyond that, I think, if that's so, we are then exposed to the emotional and relational complexity of ourselves as people engaged in the work. Well, I was in email contact a few days ago with a final year qualifying social work master's student at the University of East London and Tavistock. And she wrote to me in an email, what you can see on the screen: "I am now in the thick of my work in a child in need team in a London borough, and finding it really interesting but very challenging. I can really see how the fast pace of the work can lead some social workers to feel a need to switch off emotionally and only engage at a surface level. It can sometimes feel that I'm swimming in lots of feelings, perceptions and so on that I haven't been able to make sense of and don't have the time to think about them." Now, this is as good a way of any as making the point. How can anyone really claim to be sure that they know what to do under such sort of emotional and organisational conditions? And would reduced caseloads, although obviously a helpful would, really be the whole of the solution? That's part of what I'm doing. Well, I'm going to be proposing quite a psychoanalytic view of the use of self in relationship-based practice. Now, in, I think, a very useful chapter called The Use of Self in Relationship-Based Practice, in a book edited by Gillian Roosh and Adrian Ward and others, called Relationship-Based Social Work, The Heart of Practice, which I hope may be on sale later. Adrian Ward argues that we need a concept of the self in social work, which encompasses its unconscious dimensions. Now, he does a good job, I think, in this chapter of trying to demystify this idea of the unconscious, which I think can be a kind of obstacle, an impediment in our efforts to extend and deepen our notion of the social work self. The trouble with discussions about the unconscious is that they very quickly become circular. I think people are easily and naturally anxious about the prospect of being asked to engage with their, in quotes, unconscious selves. The anxieties aroused are, in my view, part of having an unconscious. And I think, but in saying that, really I'm starting to assume what some people actually wish to deny, that we have unconscious anxieties and experiences, and also organised ways of protecting ourselves from what we ordinarily call defences. And I think this anxiety about all of this is a lot to do with fears about being exposed, of being caught out in the eyes of another person, seen more clearly by someone else than we can see ourselves. So I want to kind of set us on our way in thinking about the unconscious in the self and in social work via a simple illustration that I hope is not too complicated by these kinds of worries. Well, a very experienced practitioner and social work teacher on a post-qualifying social work training program that requires students to undertake supervised clinical work with individuals and families began work in a CAMHS family therapy service. Now, each week in this service, the large multidisciplinary group of practitioners and trainees meets in a workshop, and new cases are discussed, and work in progress on cases is presented by the various therapists and clinicians for group supervision. Well, on the week in question, a family, a mother and son, being seen for a 4-session assessment was presented. Not very much detailed history had been established at this stage. The adolescent boy had been angry and disruptive in school and at home. His mother had left her country of origin and separated from the boy's father quite some years ago. Her own childhood story was still shrouded in uncertainty at this point, but it seemed that both her parents had probably been killed in an accident when she was herself quite young. Well, the week after listening to the presentation of this case, the student described her experiences in a different open group on the course. And she related how she had experienced a very, very powerful emotional pull to work with this mother. However, she had said nothing about this at the time. Later the same day, travelling home, she recounted how she had begun to recall that it was actually the anniversary of her own father's death. And she also remarked to us that she had suffered several bereavements in recent years. She said, "I feel a bit like an orphan myself." Well, I just want to note several features of this quite simple story. First of all, the woman has what I want to call an emotional experience. She registers this in herself, and she recognises within it a powerful impulse to act in relation to the case, to take the case on, to sort of rush forward. But she doesn't do this. At this point, she doesn't really know, I think, what the experience means, or what contribution her own emotional life and biography is making to it. However, I think she did know at this point that the experience of listening to the case presentation was the trigger for her own emotional experiences. Now, this may seem obvious, but actually it's not something we should take for granted, because a lot of what I want to speak about is the way we get mixed up between ourselves and other people, including service users and colleagues and managers and so forth. So in one respect, I think this illustration shows the worker holding on to the boundary between herself and the characters in the case, but in another respect, the boundary has been lost. So, second, what she does is she waits, and I think in a sort of unbidden manner, associations and connections arise with her. Her realisation about the anniversary, and beyond this, of her inner preoccupation with other losses. Now, as this happens, the original experience begins to have a meaning and a form for her in terms of herself, and she can recognise and name it as a powerful identification with the client and her childhood losses in relation to her own. Well, third, I think she is now in a better position to actually think about the possibility of working with the, quote, orphaned mother in relation to her own orphaned self. Her strong identification with the client has, I think, at least two aspects to it. On the one hand, it may serve as an important basis for empathy and understanding. On the other hand, the power of the experiences mobilised in her might signal to her that taking on this case is going to involve her in a longer and deeper process of emotional engagement with herself and her own losses. So fourth, we can appreciate, I think, a central issue about the use and perhaps the potential misuse or abuse of the self in social work. True emotional contact with our service users involves the necessity, I think, of losing the boundary between ourselves and them, and then recovering it. As a colleague of mine puts it, to do this kind of work, you must have the capacity to be disturbed by the work. Indeed, allowing yourself to be disturbed is the core of the work. Without this, you are not in a meaningful, emotionally engaged relationship with the work. Well, we might ask whether this illustration really is an example of unconscious identification between worker and service user. I don't want to get too involved in technical or theoretical discussions of what the unconscious is or how it differs from the pre-conscious, the ego, the id, and so on. But I think in a meaningful sense, what I believe we see in this short story is a process unfolding in the self of the worker, one in which there is a movement from something like unconscious identification in the direction of conscious awareness of the components of identification with characters in the case. Now, the sort of internal sources of the worker's original emotional experience are actually comparatively accessible to her and sort of psychically tolerable to her. We might say that her own experiences of loss and bereavement occupy a place somewhere on the boundary between her pre-conscious and her unconscious. Or alternatively, we might think that she has actually functional and useful defences in relation to her own losses, ones that enable her to continue to conduct herself professionally and appropriately so that she can wait and allow the deeper significance of her state of mind to take shape for her and become understandable and knowable at a later point in time. Now none of us can operate without such defences. Otherwise we would all be maddened by our own mental pain all of the time, because we've all got it. Well, in trying to think about the complexity of our emotional and unconscious functioning in social work, I think we need to always bear this in mind. Defences are necessary, healthy, and functional, unless, of course, they are too rigid, fixed, as it were, to allow us any access to the states of mind in which they are protecting us. So we can imagine another practitioner, or maybe the same person at a different phase of life, or the same person subject to sort of temporary excessive emotional pressure in themselves. We can imagine them responding differently to the case presentation, becoming perhaps angry and dismissive of the mother, or contemptuous of her, angry at her inability to parent her child sensitively and properly. Well, psychoanalytically, one would expect in a response of this kind to find a kind of correlate in how the individual relates to her own vulnerability and pain, maybe with a kind of condemning or punitive or critical attitude to its emergence in herself. Now this might constitute a sort of stricter form of defence, harder to get behind, and more likely to be projected onto others, in this case, perhaps the service user. So, from one quite sort of fleeting experience, during one session of one day in the life of one practitioner, I hope that we're led towards some sort of appreciation of the importance of the stance that we take up towards the place of the self in social work. Now, the example I've given is actually quite innocuous in many ways. Most of you are no doubt engaged hourly and daily in far, far more testing, complex, risky, conflicted, anxiety-provoking, and sometimes indeed frightening practice encounters. But that, I think, only, I hope, serves to reinforce my point. Once we allow, not so much that we sort of should be, but that we just inevitably are emotionally embroiled all the time in this very challenging work, in a more or less emotionally open way, and that the possibility of good work entails an equally challenging and sort of continuing engagement with ourselves, then I think the implications of this stance are vast. Well, before returning a bit further to explore the implications of that, I want to notice the way in which the practice the example I've been exploring resonates with the thinking of Wilfred Bion, who was a psychoanalyst and psychiatrist who worked at Tavistock for many years, and arguably transformed thinking about the nature of psychoanalysis and its applications in different fields more than anyone since Freud. The idea of containment originates with Bion. And I think we can see it at work in the story I've just told. Bion held that all proper thinking is at root an emotional experience. We can perhaps think about what this means if we consider what happens when the mind is not able to achieve the kind of emotional processing that I've tried to evoke, or does it in ways that puts a sort of distance between emotional experiences and the self. So just to follow my earlier thought, had the practitioner had a much more defended conscious relationship to her own experiences of loss and repudiated them much more critically and harshly, then she might in all likelihood have projected this onto the service user, in which case that service user will be perceived and sort of cognitively constructed, perhaps as inadequate or failing or bad and so on. So emotions and cognitions are intricately interrelated. But as I've said, what actually happens is that the worker contains a sort of inchoate emotional experience within herself rather than expelling it. And that is vital for what subsequently happens. Something like what Bion referred to as reverie occurs. An internal process of allowing meaning and sort of sense and understanding to take shape. Now this transforms raw, unsymbolized experience into experience that is knowable. And the possibility of emerges of actually representing what's going on in the self, to the self and to others. Now, Bion used rather technical terms to capture these processes. He called unprocessed experience beta elements. And the process of mentalizing them and giving meaning to them, alpha function. And these produce alpha elements, thoughts that might be the basis of dreams, at least. And alpha elements, coherent thoughts, make up a kind of boundary between the conscious and the unconscious. And they go to form something in his view called the contact barrier, that boundary. So Bion held that really in the absence of processes of this kind, we can't even have dreams, and in his model of the mind, dreams do occupy a very important position, somewhere between, as it were, sort of unconscious experience and everyday conduct. And dreams are themselves a variety of thinking upon which other registers of more abstract cognitive thought depend. Well, by and large, we are all inclined to find it easier to digest pleasurable or satisfying experiences than we are painful, disturbing, or anxiety-provoking ones. Now, psychoanalytic and relationship-based approaches to social work, or perhaps anything else, are sometimes castigated for wanting to focus on the negative rather than the positive. And there can be grounds for this criticism. Pathologizing people does no one any good. But something different, clear-sighted, fearless recognition of the anxieties, the risks, the dangers, the conflicts, the deceptions and so on entailed by practice situations, and located as much in our colleagues and ourselves as in service users. These things, I think, are absolutely fundamental to the possibility of good practice. And given that, I think it's a matter of regret, really, that in all the various statements of competence and capability for social work, you can't find really any meaningful statement about such capacities. Now, arguably, actually, that fact that you can't find such a statement is itself a kind of collective professional defence against really entering the emotional sort of territory that I'm talking about today. And I think it's a defence that runs very deep in the profession, maybe in our culture. Well, just to go back to the student who I quoted earlier, in response to her comments, I sent her a kind of early draft of this talk, and she wrote back to me. And she said, your paper reminded me of a comment made to me recently by someone who acts as a consultant to children's social care teams and also does inspections of children's social care departments. This person is on a post-qualifying course at the Tavistock at the moment, that said they were finding the central emphasis on psychodynamic theories tedious. I said how interesting and important I was finding that aspect of my learning, and the person said to me, it's of no use to you when you need to remove a child from a family. I didn't get a chance to explore that comment with the person, but got the sense that they thought that an emphasis on unconscious motives and so on was a distraction from the main business of child protection. well, I don't have time to take up that response in great detail, but I think we only need to consider the evidence from the most high profile of recent child abuse tragedies, which of course are the tip of an iceberg of similar cases, to recognise how frequently we fail to act when we need to, or we act, but we evade acting on the thing or in relation to the people we really need to act in relation to, or we take excessive action when a more measured approach would be better, and so forth. Now, a good deal has been written about this kind of thing, but not enough, and it doesn't get enough attention. I'm just going to make use of one, I think, very good recent publication on this theme. And it emphasises a common but vital theme that I think emerges in research that sort of gets beneath the surface of social work practice. And this is that very often apparently irrational, bizarre, or even perverse decisions about what to do or not to do in our work, in fact stem from the profound and intense difficulty of actually seeing and being able to know, that is, to register in ourselves what is actually happening in the work, what's staring us in the face sometimes. So Anna Harvey's paper, Getting to Grips with Social Work, discusses in depth her assessment of a family where 3 children had been removed from the care of their parents, but 2 of them subsequently returned, despite evidence of likely continuing abuse. Now she, in the course of doing her assessment, is engaged, first of all, in observations in the family centre. So she says, during the first family session at the centre, I observed from behind a one-way mirror and saw very disturbing behaviour from Grace, who was one of the older children who'd been returned to the home. Grace, who played unnoticed by her parents and the 2 workers in the room. Grace had found a lifelike baby doll, which she quickly realised had a button at the back of it to make it cry. She switched it on, and it proceeded to cry mercilessly for the whole session, which was studiously ignored by the adults in the room. Grace then proceeded to stab the doll in the face with the feeding bottle over and over again, hitting the doll hard in the face. She did this repeatedly, but mechanically, as if half dead herself, looking flat and walking round the room, so that she was directly in front of all the adults. When she stood in front of them, she kept repeating her actions with the screaming doll, and also forced her fingers and thumbs into the doll's eyes and thumped it on the back. Despite her best attempts to communicate what her preoccupations were through play, and her unspoken understanding of why they were all at the family centre, Grace continued to be ignored by the adults who were engaged with the social worker in general conversation about parents. She eventually gave up her attempts at being noticed and placed the doll down, lying under the noses of the adults in the centre of the room where they were all sitting around. When I questioned staff after the session whether they had seen Grace hitting the doll, and asked them why they had not brought this disturbing behaviour to the parents' attention or even commented on it during the session, the workers explained that they had felt paralysed by what they saw. They felt they could do nothing to draw attention to the child's play, as they were so shocked that they could not move. Although they said they had seen Grace hit the doll and had full view of her disturbed actions, they did not show this during the session itself, and looked as if they just could not see her. I felt shocked and angry that the workers did not interpret and act on the child's communications. But she continues, despite my anger and what I perceived as a failure to work with the family properly, I experienced the same paralysing dynamics once I began my own direct work. It was hard to think why the 2 older children had been left with their parents, given the serious nature of the abuse to John, the youngest of the children, who was still in care, and why they needed to be assessed again when all the evidence showed that neither of the parents was able to take responsibility for John's abuse. But this was common in many of the referrals that the family centre had. Well, these short extracts from Anna Harvey's very complex paper, because there's a lot more in what she's got to say, persuade me that the individual quoted earlier who consults to and inspects local authorities, children's service departments, he isn't just wrong when he says that psychoanalytic theory is of no use when you get to remove a child from their family. Or actually, to put it more accurately, I think it's psychoanalytical, real in-depth, relationship-based experience that we need. Theory just helps us think a bit more clearly about such experience. Now, beyond thinking on the way the mind develops and works, or does not develop and work, I think results in a rather different idea of what psychoanalysis is, or what it can contribute to social work from the traditional one. And to me, in summary, what it means is a method for enlarging our capacity to think, and especially our capacity to tolerate thinking about emotionally painful and anxiety-provoking matters. An increased capacity for this thing called containment in ourselves. And I think we can kind of see this at work in our half of the camp and our own practice. It doesn't make her perfect. It's not knowledge. She's doing like students in the first story and the rating processes, and presumably has to refine the capacity to know what is happening. It's easier to stay with the task of seeing and registering what is happening right under your nose when you are observing than it is when you are directly involved. But I think this speaks to the importance of social work in developing powers close emotional observation of both itself and others. So this leads me on to want to say a few things about training social workers. I'm just giving a small piece of this, I'll come back to it. Now many social work qualifying and post-qualifying programs now do actually require qualifying practitioners to undertake a short infant or young child observation. Now the aim of this, I think, is less to teach people firsthand about child development, although that is a useful part of the process, but much more centrally to help them develop stronger capacities for self-observation, including self-observation of how difficult it is to observe and self-observe. I think the main thing people find hard about the observational task is the requirement not to act or intervene or become involved in the situation, not to sort of leap into rescue mode at the first sign of distress, pain or anxiety. But what this develops in people is a stronger capacity for containment of their own emotional responses in work-related settings, the ability to reflect on and think about strong feelings and the complex basis of our impulse to act. Well, at the Tavistock, for example, if you undertake a post-qualifying training, you will engage in any or all of a whole variety of learning opportunities that develop your capacity to tolerate, name, and think about and understand powerful emotional experiences in transactions with service users, in teams and networks, within groups, and within larger organisations. Now, over the years, I've reached the conclusion that in some sort of combination, these learning opportunities can provide practitioners with a developmental experience that, first of all, goes a very long way in promoting the kind of personal, professional growth that maybe individual therapy does. But quite often it leads to people seeking personal therapy, but very importantly, that it promotes development in ways that actually having individual therapy or even group therapy can't. Ways that actually are essential to being a social worker and the social work tasks and dimensions of it I'm talking about. Now, what might these be? Well, again, I don't really have time or space to explore in detail how all this takes place. What I'm really hoping in the things I've said to you today are that the material I've presented and the commentary will be food for thought in relation to the various workshops and other sessions in today's conference. But at a slight risk of unbalancing your experience of the rest of the day, I'm going to really finish by saying a little bit about one of the later presenters' work. partly because I know it quite well, and partly also because it illustrates something about this kind of wider concept of the use of the self in social work, which we need in social work. One that really involves a sort of notion of being able to reflectively and authoritatively engage with a whole psychosocial context. That's the whole psychosocial context of both service users' lives and minds and families and networks and communities, but also the psychosocial context of the practice environment, our teams, networks, organisations. I mean, what keeps us awake at night? Sometimes it is actually the direct work with service users, but as often as not it is stresses and strains with colleagues, with managers and with organisations. Well, these are absolute emotional experiences as much as any of the other things I've tried to evoke. Well, Jane Hurd, who is going to speak later this morning, has undertaken clinically grounded research into what she calls reaching hard to reach adolescents. And this is rooted in her own long experience of doing this work in various kinds of settings. Her research is therefore in a way an attempt to come to understand better practice experiences that she already knows quite a lot about, but hasn't investigated systematically or hasn't conceptualised as richly as she could. Now, I just want to focus on it or flag it up briefly because I think it provides us with a good illustration of the inherently psychosocial social work self at work. Now, she and I have talked briefly about the view of the work that I have, and we hope to make use of this way of doing things to establish the idea that we need to be in dialogue during this day. And put simply, I think that Jane and I think similarly in many ways, but also differently in others, about the use of self in social work, and also about things like the place of therapy in developing our professional selves. Well, one feature of her work is that it very quickly became apparent from her doing her sort of literature searching and reading that this label, hard to reach, is really nothing more than that, a label. No one actually knows what it means, or who it refers to. One of her early hypotheses, therefore, has been that it may refer as much to the state of mind and functioning of services as it does to the characteristics of service users, or in this case, service non-users. Young people who are troubled and often troublesome, who conventional services or educational responses find hard to engage, may very quickly drop out of sight, out of organisational mind, from which a position it's very easy to see how, if official discourse thinks it's got to say something about them, it may come up with the sort of comfortable, ambiguous and probably meaningless concept of hard to reach. Well, Jane's research is in fact rooted in her own confidence that we can reach and engage many of these adolescents if a suitably responsive, flexible, undogmatic, one might say undefended state of mind is available in the practitioner, the service. Well, I'm going to leave what I want to say about her work there. What I'm really wanting to sort of flag up is the kind of listening about the complex nature of the self of the practitioner at work in the practice she describes. So all of this leads me to want to come to a conclusion. People like the adolescents who Jane succeeded in reaching occupy a place in society that is kind of similar in my mind, analogous in my mind to the unsymbolised, unprocessed, raw emotional and mental context described by Bion as existing prior to the act of reverie and alpha function that makes them knowable to the individual mind. Now, the list of social groups who people like us know about, but who, in terms of the wider society, occupy actually an equivalent sort of out of sight, out of mind status in society is very long. Asylum seekers, homeless people, prisoners, people with serious and indeed not so serious mental health problems, and even in truth I think the majority of children in care or children suffering abuse and neglect. they seem to me to occupy, in terms of the wider society and culture's awareness and willingness to engage with the reality of what actually, when you add them all together, these very large populations of people, what the nature of their suffering, their predicaments, their difficulties, their conflicts are. You know, it's a kind of thin capacity that our society has. So my personal belief is that there is an ethical dimension to this whole idea of the use of self in social work. And it's got a number of elements. That in a way, our ethical duty is, first of all, to know what we do know about, that the rest of the world is largely protected from having to know about all the things I just evoked. First of all, we've got to realise that we really know something. But secondly, we do have to develop languages, a vocabulary, for speaking about these complex and disturbing matters, and also skills in communicating to others about them, others who may not want to hear that much. And because I think that this inevitably positions us politically in relation to our service user populations and the rest of society, potentially as advocates, as agitators, as unwelcome messengers about the things we know about. I think we need collective organisations, communities of interest, to both support us and support us in achieving our goals, which I'm suggesting is partly about our responsibility to represent to the wider society what we know. Something I don't think that as a profession we've actually been that good at doing, partly because we have been somewhat beleaguered from that profession. Well, as I've said, as social workers, we do know more than the average citizen about the conditions of life and the social and personal suffering of these populations. But how deeply and directly we can really bear to know is the central question I've been trying to talk about today. We can only actually come to know properly by being able to be in relationship with other people. And that at heart is also a painful process for us. So enlarging our capacity to bear such pain, while also protecting ourselves sufficiently to be capable of continuing to engage with the work, this is really, I think, what is at the heart of relationship-based practice. Thank you. And we do have 5 minutes for the scheduled tea break, so I'm happy to listen to any responses or take any questions. I prefer to listen to responses. I've been talking long enough. You might want to start to talk to me about it.
I've got a question. I'm called an old school social worker in my office.
You probably can't be heard that side of the room.
Okay.
So maybe...
I'm called an old school social worker because I've kind of retired and gone back into practice after a long time. And we're completely inundated with work in child protection. And I think I agree with everything you said. It's getting the message across when you have to do, you've got to meet all the targets we're due to have an inspection. I'm not quite sure that I agree with you with what you said about the ambivalence, because I do think it's almost impossible to have time to reflect, and it doesn't come up in supervision if you get it.
That's a real shame to say that.
Actually, could you stand? I think people probably can't hear. Sorry.
I I think it's a real shame that you say that, because I don't see how you can even do an assessment if you can't reflect. You can't do analysis if you can't reflect, and so it's a fundamental core skill for social workers. And I have some anxieties in the wording of some of the slides where you talked about developing a language, because I think historically part of the reason that social work didn't have the professional status that it perhaps deserves is because people listened to social workers and there was this image of vegetarian, open-toed sandals, predominantly female, hairy legs, all of the sort of negative social connotations attached to those people delivering a service. And it comes about because of the language that is used to describe social work, and it's really difficult to talk about what you do because there are issues of confidentiality that prevent you from doing that. So the son, the Sun cartoon, the child, the social worker that takes the child, the social worker that doesn't take the charge, and you can't do right for doing wrong, but you can't actually speak openly about what you do. And I think there's a real risk of people finding yet another language, of having more social work language, which actually doesn't say what it means. And I think if we are more focused, if we reflect more, our assessments are better and the quality of our work is better. And I think that, I don't say I agree with all of the Munro report because I'm not into telling lies, but I do think there are some really good threads in there. And I think the concept of reflection is absolutely vital, and I think there is a risk when people have got high caseloads that they end up functioning like the girl that was reflected on who was doing a PQ up at the Tabby, that you end up being functional and not having time to think. I think that is true, but if in fact you are unable to think, then I would question whether or not you should be in frontline social work. And I think that sometimes we are frightened to actually voice that, and I think it's something that we need to voice from the bottom up and from the top down, if in fact we're going to reach a stage where the quality of our work is recognised in the courts, in the press, in society, and that people are going to be less intimidated by the prospect. You have schools that say, things don't improve, I'm going to have to tell the social. What the hell is that about, You just sort of, the whole professional image, if people actually can't do that, is never going to improve. I guess that it saddens me that people are still saying that now after so long, because actually it doesn't have to do that.